There is a painting hidden in the basements of the Vatican. It has never been displayed to the public. It has never been reproduced in books on sacred art. And according to testimonies from 3 cardinals who saw it before they died, it shows something that the Church could never admit. The face of Mary, Mother of Jesus, in a moment that contradicts almost everything you have learned about her. It is not a pious painting. It is not a portrait of divine submission. It is the face of a first-century Jewish woman, with wrinkles around her eyes, calloused hands from hard work, and a gaze that carries weight, doubt, and a kind of courage that no one associates with the sanctified figure we know. This painting, they say, was commissioned by a heretical bishop in the 4th century, before the dogmas became immutable, and it was hidden for a reason, because it shows Mary as she really was, a woman, not an icon, not a marble statue with eyes turned to the sky. A real person, with history, context, dilemmas, and choices that have been systematically erased over 2 millennia. Have you ever stopped to think about who Mary really was before she became the Blessed Virgin? Before the stained glass, the processions, the theological titles, and the endless litanies? Before her name became synonymous with impossible purity and absolute obedience? Because the truth is this: Mary was a Jewish woman who lived under Roman occupation, in one of the most violent and politically explosive regions of the ancient world. She did not speak Latin, she did not wear a sky-blue veil, she did not have a halo, and her story does not begin with an angel descending from the heavens in a beam of golden light. Her story begins in a forgotten village called Nazareth, a place so insignificant that it does not even appear in the official records of the Roman Empire. A place where girls of 12 or 13 were promised in marriage to older men, where hunger was chronic, where survival depended on uncertain harvests and the mercy of a God who seemed too distant to hear the prayers of the poor. And it was there, in that brutal context, that a young woman named Miriam, not Mary, but Miriam in Hebrew, found herself pregnant before marriage, and that, at that time, in that place, was a death sentence. But you have never heard this version of the story, have you? You heard the edited version, the official version, the version that transforms a terrified young woman into an ethereal figure of divine acceptance, the version that erases the fear, the shame, the mortal risk, the social rejection, the scandal that must have erupted in Nazareth when people began to realize that the young woman promised to Joseph was visibly pregnant. Because the truth is that Mary was not just chosen by God, she was chosen to carry a burden that could have killed her, and she chose, with the little power she had, to accept that burden. But what did that choice mean? What was at stake? What did she really feel? What did she think? And who was she before history transformed her into a symbol? These questions, for centuries, were considered blasphemy. To ask about Mary's humanity was to question her borrowed divinity. It was to doubt the dogma. It was to open a dangerous door to the idea that perhaps, just perhaps, the Church had distorted her story as much as it distorted the stories of so many others. And that is exactly what Baruch Spinoza did. In 1670, when he published the theological political treatise, Spinoza dared to do something revolutionary. He read the scriptures as a historian, not as a believer, and by doing so, he began to deconstruct, piece by piece, the official narrative about figures like Mary. He asked, what do we really know about her? What was added later? What was invented to serve the interests of the Church? And his conclusions were explosive. Mary was not a virgin in the biological sense. She was a young Jewish woman who had a premature pregnancy. The term virgin was the result of a translation error from Hebrew to Greek, and then from Greek to Latin. The original word, alma, simply means young woman. But when it was translated into Greek as parthenos, it took on the meaning of physical virginity. And when the Church needed a miracle to justify the divinity of Jesus, that translation became dogma. But Spinoza went further. He said, Mary was not passive. She was not just a sacred womb, a vessel for the divine. She was a woman who made decisions in a world where women had no right to decide. She was a mother who raised a revolutionary son, who challenged empires, who died as a political criminal, and she was there, until the end. When all the male disciples fled in fear, she remained at the foot of the cross. And this Mary, the real Mary, the historical Mary, was systematically erased, replaced by an icon of unattainable purity, transformed into propaganda to control real women. used to create an impossible standard of femininity, virginal yet a mother, submissive yet worthy of veneration, human yet beyond the reach of any real humanity. And why? Because the church needed a symbol. But Mary was not a symbol. She was a person. And it is this person that we will get to know now. In the next few minutes, you will hear the story of Mary that no one has told you. The story based on historical evidence, anthropological context, textual analysis, and Spinoza's radical philosophy. The story of a Jewish girl in Nazareth who became a mother under impossible circumstances, who raised a son destined to change the world, and who paid the highest price for it. You will discover who really announced her pregnancy. It was not an angel. You will learn why Joseph almost abandoned her. It was not for celestial reasons. You will understand what it meant to be the mother of Jesus in a world that killed revolutionaries. And you will see how the church transformed a human, brutal, real story into a theological fairy tale. And in the end, you will have to decide, do you prefer the comfortable legend or the uncomfortable truth? Because once you see Mary as she really was, you can never see her the same way again. And perhaps that is exactly what the church has always feared. Welcome to the real story. The story before Dogma. The story of Mary, Nazareth, 7 years before the Common Era. A village that barely appeared on maps. 200 people, maybe 300. Limestone houses with thatched roofs. Dirt streets that turned to mud in the winter rains. Goats, chickens, dust. The constant smell of sweat, animal dung, and bread baking in clay ovens. And silence. That heavy silence of places where nothing important ever happens. It was there that Miriam lived. Not the Mary of the stained glass. Miriam, a common Hebrew name, as common as any other Jewish girl in Galilee. She was about 13 years old. Some historians suggest 12. The exact age does not matter as much as what that age meant in that context. She was transitioning from childhood to adulthood according to Jewish standards. And in that society, that meant one thing: marriage. But before we talk about her marriage, we need to understand who this girl was. Because the church taught us that Mary was special from birth, that she was conceived without original sin, that she was chosen from the very beginning, that her purity was supernatural. But all of this is late theological constructions, dogmas created centuries later by men in councils who never stepped in the dust of Nazareth, who never felt the weight of Roman occupation, who never had to choose between survival and dignity. The real Miriam was the daughter of Joachim and Anna, according to apocryphal tradition, but even that information is dubious. What we know with more certainty is that she belonged to a poor family. Not destitute, but poor. A family that worked, that depended on the harvests, that paid impossible taxes to the Romans and to the temple in Jerusalem, that lived on the constant edge between having enough and starving. And Miriam, like all the girls her age, knew what her destiny was. She would be promised to a man, probably older, probably chosen by her father in negotiation with local families. She would marry, have children, take care of the house, obey her husband, age early, and probably die before the age of 40 if luck allowed her to reach that far. There was no escape from that trajectory, not for a Jewish girl in Nazareth, not for someone without power, without wealth, without connections. Her world was tiny. The village, the hills around, maybe an occasional trip to Sepphoris, the nearest city, a few kilometers away. Jerusalem was a distant dream. Rome, a name that caused fear and hatred, and the rest of the world simply did not exist. But Miriam could read. This is important, very important, because although the majority of Jewish women of that time were illiterate, there are textual indications that she had some level of education. When the Gospel of Luke puts the Magnificat in her mouth, that revolutionary song that she supposedly proclaims when visiting her cousin Elizabeth, the text is filled with references to the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures. She cites the prophets. She echoes the Psalms, and these are not superficial citations. They are complex, intertwined references that demonstrate a deep familiarity with the sacred texts. This tells us something crucial. Miriam was not ignorant. She was educated, perhaps by her father, perhaps at the local synagogue where exceptionally girls could have access to the scrolls, perhaps by a progressive rabbi who believed that all children, including girls, should know the Torah. We do not know, but we know the outcome. She had a formed mind, a developed religious consciousness, an ability to think, question, interpret. And this makes everything that happened afterward even more complex, because when the moment of her betrothal arrived, she was promised to a man named Joseph, a tekton. The Greek word that the Gospels use to describe his profession is usually translated as carpenter, but that is inaccurate. A tekton was a craftsman, someone who worked with wood, but also with stone, a builder, someone who made everything, furniture, agricultural tools, small repairs in houses, even more complex structures when necessary. Joseph was older than Miriam, much older according to some traditions. 30 years, 40? The texts are not clear, but he had already been married before. He had children from a previous marriage. He was a widower. And now, for the second time in his life, he was taking on the commitment of marriage. The Jewish betrothal of that period was not like we know today. It was a binding legal contract. From the moment the betrothal was established, the two were considered married for all legal purposes, although they did not yet cohabit. The consummation of the marriage only occurred after the final ceremony, usually a year later. But during this waiting period, breaking the betrothal required a formal divorce, and infidelity during the betrothal was treated as adultery, with all the consequences that this implied. And it was during this betrothal period that it happened. Miriam became pregnant. Stop for a moment and think about what this means. Not from a theological perspective, from a human perspective. A 13-year-old girl promised to a man, pregnant before the consummation of marriage, in a village of 200 people where everyone knows everyone else's life, where the scandal is not just shameful, it is deadly, because Jewish law was clear. Deuteronomy 22:23-24. If a young woman promised in marriage was found with another man, both were to be brought to the city gate and stoned to death. The penalty was brutal. And although in practice this law was not always applied with extreme rigor in the first century, especially under Roman occupation, which limited Jewish authority for executions, public humiliation, social ostracism, and the risk of community violence, were absolutely real. Miriam was in danger. Real danger. Deadly danger. And she knew it. So what happened? How did she become pregnant? And here we arrive at the first major divergence between the official narrative and historical reality. The Church tells us, angelic announcement, conception by the Holy Spirit, perpetual virginity. But Spinoza, reading the text with the eyes of a historian, saw something else. He saw a premature pregnancy. He saw a social scandal. He saw a young woman in a situation of extreme vulnerability, trying to survive in a world that condemned her. And he saw in the texts the marks of a narrative that was rewritten, edited, theologically transformed to erase what really happened. Because make no mistake, the Gospels were written decades after the events. Mark, the oldest, around the year 70, Matthew and Luke in the 80s, 90s, John even later. And when they were written, there was already an established Christian community that needed to justify, defend, and glorify Jesus. And to do this, they needed to make his mother something more than an ordinary woman. They needed to create an origin myth. And that is exactly what they did. But in the subtext, in the contradictions between the Gospels, in the revealing omissions, Spinoza detected the real story. And it is very different. There was no angel Gabriel descending in a beam of light. There was a terrified young woman trying to explain the inexplicable to a fiancé who had every reason to abandon her. And in the next blocks, we will discover exactly how this happened. We will see who really was the father of the child. We will understand why Joseph, against all expectations, decided not to denounce her, and we will follow Miriam through the most dangerous journey of her life, being the mother of a man whom the world would crucify. But for now, understand this. Mary before the Dogma was a Jewish girl named Miriam, living under occupation, promised in marriage, and suddenly pregnant in circumstances that could have killed her. Everything that came after, every decision she made, every impossible choice she had to make, starts from this point, from this moment of terror and absolute vulnerability. And that is where the story really begins. So she was pregnant, and someone needed to know. Someone needed to be informed. And this is where the official narrative of the Gospels comes into play with one of the most famous scenes in Christian history, the Annunciation. The angel Gabriel appearing to Mary, declaring that she will conceive by the power of the Holy Spirit, and she responding with those words that have been painted in millions of works of art, "Behold the handmaid of the Lord. Be it unto me according to thy word. It is beautiful. It is poetic. It is theologically perfect. And Spinoza said, it is completely impossible. Not because God cannot perform miracles. Spinoza was not discussing abstract possibilities. He was discussing evidence, and the evidence pointed to something much more human, much more complex, and much more problematic for the church to admit. Because if you strip away the layer of miracle imposed by the evangelists decades later, what remains is this: a young pregnant woman who needs to tell someone, and that someone is not an angel. It is a man. And that man has a name. But before we get to that man, we need to understand something fundamental about how the Gospels were constructed. Luke, who narrates the Annunciation in more detail, was writing between 80–90 AD, 50–60 years after the events. He did not know Mary, did not know Joseph, was not in Nazareth. He was collecting oral traditions, stories that had already passed through 2 or 3 generations of storytellers, each adding, embellishing, theologizing. And Luke had a purpose. He was not writing objective history. He was writing gospel, good news, salvific narrative, and to do this, he needed Jesus to be more than a Jewish rabbi executed by the Romans. He needed him to be the Messiah, the Son of God, and if the Son of God had a normal birth, conceived by normal means, he would be just another prophet, another revolutionary, another among many who challenged Rome and died on the cross. But if his birth were miraculous, then everything changed. And that is exactly what Luke and Matthew did. They took a scandalous premature pregnancy and transformed it into a divine miracle. But they left clues. There are always clues. Matthew, for example, is obsessed with proving that Joseph was not the biological father of Jesus. He insists on this, repeats, explains that Joseph did not know her until she had brought forth her firstborn son. The phrase "did not know her" is a biblical euphemism for did not have sexual relations. Matthew is defending Joseph. He is saying Joseph was not responsible for this pregnancy. Why? Because there were clearly rumors, clearly there were accusations, and Matthew is trying to quell those rumors with his narrative, but in doing so, he confirms that the rumors existed. And Luke does something even more revealing. He places Mary, right after the Annunciation, hastily traveling to her cousin Elizabeth's house, who is also pregnant. And Mary stays there for 3 months. 3 whole months, why? The official narrative says she went to help her elderly cousin, but think historically. A 13-year-old girl, newly betrothed, leaves her village and spends 3 months away, in another region, alone, without her fiancé, without her immediate family. That does not make cultural sense, unless she was fleeing, unless she needed to leave Nazareth because staying there, visibly pregnant, would be too dangerous. Unless those 3 months were the necessary time for the situation to cool down, for some solution to be negotiated, so she could return with some kind of story that would protect her. And when she returns, what does she find? Joseph still there. Joseph, who, according to Matthew, had already decided to put her away privately to avoid exposing her to public shame. But then Joseph has a dream. And in that dream, an angel tells him not to fear to take Mary, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. Spinoza read this and said, Joseph, heart. For some reason he decided to protect Maria instead of abandoning her. But that reason was not an angel. It was something much more earthly. Perhaps love, perhaps pity, perhaps an agreement between families, perhaps social pressure to avoid a greater scandal. Perhaps even the conviction that the child, no matter how conceived, deserved a chance to be born. But here is the question that no one asks. What if Maria truly believed that her pregnancy was divine? What if she really had lived a mystical experience, an inner revelation so powerful that it convinced her she was carrying the promised Messiah? Would that be madness? Would it be self-deception? Or would it be something we need to understand within the context of a deeply religious young Jewish woman immersed in the prophecies of Isaiah, waiting for the promised liberator, living under brutal oppression? Because you see, Spinoza was not trying to ridicule Maria. He was trying to understand her. And to understand her, we need to consider all possibilities, including the possibility that she had a genuine religious experience that made her interpret her pregnancy in a way that escaped rational comprehension. After all, Spinoza was well aware of the power of mystical experiences. He himself had had a few, and he knew that what matters is not whether the experience was real in the objective sense, but how it shaped the life of the person who lived it. And Maria's experience shaped everything. It shaped her relationship with Jose. It shaped her relationship with the child growing in her womb. It shaped her courage to face the scandal. And it shaped, eventually, her willingness to follow this son to the foot of the cross when all the other men, including the disciples who swore eternal loyalty, fled in fear. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let's return to Nazareth, to the pregnant Maria, to the doubting Jose, and to what really happened. And you who are listening to this story now, have you ever stopped to think about it? When you look at Maria, do you see a real woman or just the symbol that you were taught to see? Because here is the truth. The real Maria is braver, more complex, more fascinating than any marble statue can capture. And the deeper we go into this story, the more impossible it becomes to return to the simplified version. If you are feeling this, if something in you is changing as you listen, leave a comment now. Tell me, do you think Maria knew what she was doing? Do you think she had a real choice? Or do you think she was just a pawn in a much larger game that she never fully understood? I want to know what you think, because this is not just my philosophical journey. It's ours. And if you've made it this far, it's because something in you seeks the truth behind the dogmas. So be part of this. Subscribe to the channel now, because this is just the beginning. And what comes next will question everything you thought you knew, not just about Maria, but about how stories become myths, how women are transformed into symbols, and how the truth, when it finally emerges, is always more disturbing and more liberating than we expected. Jose was not sleeping. It was almost 4 a.m, and he was sitting outside his small house, looking at the stars over Nazareth. The night was cold. His cloak was pulled over his shoulders, but the chill he felt did not come from the air. It came from within. It came from the decision he needed to make that was tearing his soul apart. 3 weeks ago, he had found out. Miriam was pregnant. She told him herself, not with shame, as one would expect, but with a strange kind of conviction, almost delirious, that left him even more confused. She said that a messenger from God had come to her, that the Most High had looked upon her humility, upon her faith, that the child she carried was the fulfillment of the prophecies, the Messiah, the liberator of Israel. Jose listened to her in silence, and when she finished speaking, he felt a mix of emotions so violent that he had to step away to avoid screaming. Anger, betrayal, pity, disbelief, and something worse than all that, doubt, because he knew Miriam. He had known her for years. He had seen her grow up. And he knew deep down that she was not a liar. She was not manipulative. She was, of all the young women in Nazareth, the most pious, the most serious, the most committed to the Torah and the commandments. So how could she make up such a story? How could she look him in the eye and say something so absurd with such certainty, unless she truly believed? Unless something had happened to her, some kind of vision, some kind of religious experience so powerful that it had convinced her she was carrying the Messiah. Jose knew stories of prophets who had visions. He knew accounts of people who heard divine voices. This was not completely outside the realm of Jewish experience, but happening there, with a 13-year-old girl in Nazareth, and resulting in a real physical pregnancy. That was not prophecy. That was scandal. And Jose knew what would happen if he did nothing. People were already starting to notice. Miriam was different, paler, with morning sickness, and within a few weeks, her body would begin to show undeniable signs. And then the scandal would explode, and she would be dragged before the elders, and he too, as her fiancé, would be questioned, and everything, absolutely everything, would become public, humiliating, destructive. The simplest solution, the most obvious one, was to denounce her. Take the case to the elders, present the evidence, demand a formal divorce, and let Jewish law take its course. He would be free. His reputation would be preserved. And Miriam, well, Miriam would face the consequences of her actions, or of her madness, or of her sin, depending on how the story was interpreted. But Jose couldn't do that. He tried. For weeks he tried to convince himself that this was what he should do. But every time he imagined Miriam being taken before the community, being judged, being condemned, possibly being stoned, or at best exiled and condemned to perpetual misery, something inside him refused. Then he thought of the second option, to dismiss her quietly, to give her a divorce letter privately without making public accusations, without exposing her. It would be a silent separation. He would leave for another region. She would stay with her family, and the scandal, though inevitable, would be smaller, more manageable. But even that option tormented him, because he knew what would happen to Miriam afterward. She would be a divorced and pregnant woman. No other man would ever accept her. She would be marginalized. Her child would grow up without a father, and she would spend the rest of her life carrying the weight of social shame. Spinoza, in analyzing this part of the narrative, made a crucial observation. José was in a moral trap. There was no good choice. There was no clean exit. Every option available to him would cause suffering, and it is exactly in situations like this that a person's character is revealed. Because what José did next was not the result of an angel appearing in a dream. It was the result of a moral decision he made alone, in the dark of night, wrestling with himself. He decided to stay with her. He decided to take the child as his own. He decided to face the scandal, the gossip, the accusations. He decided that if the community was going to judge someone, it would judge him too. And perhaps, just perhaps, by doing this, he could protect Miriam from the worst of humiliation. It was a decision that cost him everything. His reputation, his position in the community, his pride. Because from that moment on, everyone in Nazareth knew that José had married a pregnant woman, and the tongues spared neither of them. He was called a fool, a weak man, a man without honor. And she was called worse things. But José remained, and this, more than any angel in a dream, is the real miracle of this story, the miracle of human compassion, the miracle of a man who chose love over law, who chose to protect instead of punish, who chose to bear shame instead of inflicting suffering. And Miriam, how did she react to all this? The Gospels do not tell us. They jump straight to the birth of Jesus, as if the entire period of gestation were irrelevant. But it wasn't. Those 9 months were probably the most terrible of her life. Pregnant, judged, socially isolated, dependent on the mercy of a man who had every reason to reject her and chose not to, and within her, growing day by day, was the child she believed to be the Messiah, the child who, according to her mystical conviction, would come to liberate Israel, to bring justice, to overthrow the powerful and exalt the humble. Just as she had sung in the Magnificat, that revolutionary song that Luke placed in her heart. Mouth. But here is something that the Church never wants to admit. The Magnificat is a politically explosive text. He has brought down the mighty from their thrones and exalted the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. This is not abstract spirituality. This is revolutionary manifesto. This is the language of the oppressed who dream of the day when power structures will be inverted. And Mary, the real Mary, was not a passive figure of submissive piety. She was a woman who carried, both in her womb and in her heart, the hope of revolution. And that hope sustained her through scandal, through shame, through everything, because she needed to believe that it all had meaning, that her pain was not in vain, that her son would change the world. And in a terrible and tragic way, she was right, but not in the way she expected. The decree arrived in Nazareth at the end of autumn. A Roman messenger, accompanied by soldiers, read aloud in the village's central square. All inhabitants were to return to their cities of origin for the census ordered by Caesar Augustus. It was an imperial order. There was no negotiation. There were no exceptions. For Joseph, this meant going back to Bethlehem. He was of the lineage of David, from the tribe of Judah, and Bethlehem was his ancestral city. He had not been there for decades. He had no family left there. But Roman law did not care about that. If you were registered as originating from a certain city, that was where you had to go to be counted. And Miriam was in her 9th month of pregnancy. Any sensible person would have seen the absurdity of this. A young woman about to give birth, being forced to make a journey of nearly 150 kilometers through mountainous terrain in the dead of winter, just because an emperor in Rome decided to count his subjects for taxation purposes. But Rome was not sensible. Rome was brutal, and disobeying the decree meant imprisonment, fines impossible to pay or worse. So they went, Joseph and Miriam, he walking alongside the donkey where she was seated, wrapped in cloaks, trying to endure the jolts of the road. They took 4, maybe 5 days, sleeping outdoors some nights, stopping at crowded caravanserais others, and with each passing day, each passing hour, Miriam's body signaled that time was running out. Spinoza, analyzing this part of the narrative, asked a crucial question. Why does Luke insist so much on this census? Why does he construct this elaborate explanation about imperial decrees and impossible journeys? And the answer is obvious. Because he needs Jesus to be born in Bethlehem. Because the messianic prophecies say that the Messiah will come from Bethlehem, the city of David. And if Jesus was born in Nazareth, as he probably was, then he does not fulfill the prophecy. And if he does not fulfill the prophecy, how can he prove that he is the Messiah? So Luke creates the census, and Matthew, who also needs Bethlehem, creates another story. He says that Joseph and Mary already lived in Bethlehem and only fled to Egypt later, settling in Nazareth afterward. Two completely different stories, obvious contradictions, but both with the same goal to place Jesus in Bethlehem at the time of his birth. But let's assume for a moment that the journey really happened, that somehow, for some reason, Joseph and Miriam actually made this suicidal trip with her 9 months pregnant. What would have happened when they arrived in Bethlehem? Bethlehem was not large, perhaps 1,000 inhabitants in normal times. But during the census, the population would have exploded, families returning from all over, houses packed, roads clogged, and no place to stay. Luke says there was no room for them in the inn, so Jesus was born in a stable, and generations of Christians have romanticized this image. The divine baby being born in humility, surrounded by animals, the perfect setting for the Savior of the poor. But take away the romanticism, and what remains is horror. A young woman giving birth in a stable in the cold, with no midwife, no medical help, with nothing but Joseph, who probably knew absolutely nothing about childbirth. The sanitary conditions were non-existent. The risk of infection, hemorrhage, maternal death, infant death was extremely high. Most births at that time resulted in some kind of complication, and this was happening literally among goats and oxen, on dirty straw, with only the light of an oil lamp flickering in the darkness. Miriam was lucky to survive. The child was lucky to survive. Both could have died there, 2 more anonymous victims of Roman brutality, 2 more names that would never enter history, but they did not die. And by some biological miracle, not theological, but simply the ordinary miracle of a human body doing what human bodies have done for thousands of generations, the child was born, a boy, healthy, crying loudly, alive, and Miriam held him for the first time, bloodied, wet, screaming. And she looked at that tiny face and saw, what? The promised Messiah, the liberator of Israel, the Son of God. Or did she just see her baby, her son, a child who needed care, protection, love, a child who had come into the world under the most brutal imaginable circumstances and who depended entirely on her for survival, because that is the tension that Mary carried throughout her life, the tension between the mystical role she believed her son would play and the concrete reality of being a mother, between prophecy and motherhood, between God and humanity. And in the years to come, that tension would only increase, because raising a child is already difficult, but raising a child you believe to be the Messiah, raising a child while fleeing from a paranoid king who wants to kill him, raising a child in exile, in poverty, in constant fear, that was not in any angel's plans. That was the real life of Mary. And that is where her story stops being a fairy tale and becomes a tragedy. Herod the Great was dying. Not fast enough for his enemies, not slowly enough for him to savor the last remnants of power. He was nearly 70 years old and his body was falling apart. Skin diseases that made his flesh rot, unbearable pains that no doctor could relieve, and paranoia. Paranoia so intense that he had already killed 3 of his own sons on suspicion of conspiracy. Herod was not a Jew by birth. He was Idumean, a people forcibly converted to Judaism generations before. Rome put him on the throne because he was useful, brutal, efficient, and completely loyal to the emperor. He built fortresses, expanded the Temple of Jerusalem, turning it into one of the wonders of the ancient world, and killed anyone who threatened his power. And it was to this man, in his last months of life, that a rumor reached. A group of magi from the east had appeared in Jerusalem, asking about a king of the Jews who had recently been born. They had followed some kind of astronomical phenomenon, a star or planetary conjunction, and believed that this signaled the birth of a messianic king. For Herod, this was a death sentence. Not his, but for all the babies who could remotely fit that description. Because Herod did not believe in prophecies, he believed in threats. And any child being called King of the Jews was a threat that needed to be eliminated. Matthew is the only evangelist who tells this story, and he tells it with details that make your stomach churn. Herod secretly summoned the Magi, found out when the star had appeared, and sent them to Bethlehem with orders to find the child and report back to him. But the Magi, after visiting Jesus, were warned in a dream not to return to Herod. They fled by another route. And when Herod realized he had been deceived, he did what he always did when he felt threatened. He ordered that all boys in Bethlehem 2 years old and under be killed. The massacre of the innocents. That is how the story entered Christian tradition, painted by Renaissance masters, lamented in medieval hymns, and completely absent from all historical records outside of the Gospel of Matthew. This is a problem, because Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian who lived only decades after these events and meticulously documented the horrors of Herod's reign, mentions nothing about a massacre of babies in Bethlehem. Nothing. And Josephus did not spare Herod. He listed all the crimes, all the atrocities, all the political murders, but a genocide of children. Absolute silence. Spinoza saw this and concluded, either the massacre did not happen, or it was on such a small scale that it did not attract the attention of historians. Bethlehem had perhaps 1,000 inhabitants. The number of babies 2 years old or younger would be perhaps 20, 30 at most. In a region already accustomed to Roman violence, public executions, mass crucifixions, this could have go unnoticed in the official records. But for Matthew, the massacre was essential, because he was writing for a Jewish audience and needed to prove that Jesus was the new Moses. And just as Pharaoh had ordered the death of all Hebrew babies and Moses escaped, Herod ordered the death of the babies in Bethlehem and Jesus escaped. A perfect parallel. Messiah confirmed. But what about Mary? What would she have thought if this really happened? If she truly fled to Egypt carrying a baby just a few months old, knowing that other mothers in Bethlehem were holding the bodies of their children killed because of rumors about hers? This is the part that the church doesn't want you to think too much about. Because if Jesus was truly the Messiah, if his coming was part of a divine plan, then God allowed or even orchestrated the death of dozens of innocent children just to fulfill a prophecy. And Mary, carrying the child who was spared while others were massacred, would have to live with that, with the survivor's guilt, with the impossible question to answer, why was my child saved and theirs were not? Spinoza did not believe in divine plans that involved the sacrifice of innocents. For him that was blasphemy against the very idea of God. If God is perfect, rational, identical to nature and its laws, then God does not commit atrocities to fulfill prophecies. People commit atrocities. And then, to make sense of the trauma, they create theological narratives that turn horror into divine purpose. But let's assume something happened, that Joseph, frightened by rumors that Herod was looking for the child, decided to flee, that they really went to Egypt, that they spent months, perhaps years, living as refugees in a foreign land, depending on the charity of the Jewish community in Alexandria, surviving on the edge of misery. What did this do to Mary? How did it shape her worldview? How did it affect her relationship with the child she believed was chosen by God, but who seemed to bring death and suffering wherever he went? These questions have no easy answers, and perhaps that's why the Gospels quickly skip over this period. Luke summarizes all of Jesus' childhood in one sentence, and the boy grew and became strong, filled with wisdom. Matthew simply says that they returned from Egypt after Herod's death and settled in Nazareth. But between these summarized sentences, there are years. Years of a child growing. Years of Mary raising a child in impossible circumstances. And those years, those silent years that no one documents, may be the most important for understanding who Mary really was. Because any mother who goes through the experience of almost losing her child, of seeing him threatened with death, of having to flee as a refugee to protect him, any mother like that is fundamentally transformed by that experience. And Mary, the real Mary, did not escape this. She carried that trauma, and it shaped everything that came after. Jesus was 12 years old when he disappeared. It was during the annual Passover pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Thousands of devout Jews made this journey every year, walking in caravans, singing psalms, reciting the stories of the Exodus. Joseph and Mary were part of one of those caravans, traveling with relatives and neighbors from Nazareth. The return trip began as always, organized chaos, families saying goodbye to acquaintances, children running among the people, donkeys loaded with supplies. And in the midst of this confusion, Mary assumed that Jesus was somewhere in the caravan, with cousins, with friends, with Joseph. She didn't worry. But when night fell and they set up camp, Jesus did not appear. Mary began to search. She asked the cousins, the neighbors, nothing. Joseph went from group to group. No one had seen the boy. And then came the panic. That specific panic of parents who realize they have lost a child. They returned to Jerusalem, running, desperate. 3 days. 3 days searching in a city of hundreds of thousands of inhabitants during the busiest week of the year. 3 days of absolute terror, imagining the worst. Child trafficking was common. Accidents, diseases, 1,000 things could have happened. And where did they find Jesus? In the temple, sitting among the teachers of the law, the most respected rabbis in Israel, asking questions, debating interpretations, completely absorbed in theological discussion. Luke says that all who heard him were amazed at his intelligence and his answers. Mary exploded. "Son, why have you done this to us? Look, your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." It was not a gentle question. It was an accusation, a release of 3 days of terror and anger. And Jesus responded with something that must have broken her heart. "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" He was not talking about Joseph. He was talking about God. And at that moment, with those words, Jesus established a distance, a priority. God first, family second. And Mary, who had carried this boy, who had fled with him to Egypt, who had protected his life at the risk of her own, heard her son say that she was not his priority. Luke says that Mary and Joseph did not understand his words, but I think they understood perfectly. They just didn't want to accept it, because no parent wants to hear that their child belongs more to a divine mission than to them. No mother wants to feel that she is losing her child to something she cannot control, understand, or protect. And that is what began there, the slow, painful separation between Mary and Jesus, between mother and Messiah, between maternal love and prophetic calling. Spinoza saw something crucial in this story. Jesus, from a young age, was already breaking away from traditional family structures. He was already prioritizing his religious and philosophical convictions above social obligations. And that was not easy for anyone. Not for him, who had to choose between familial love and divine mission, and certainly not for Mary, who had to watch her son drift further away. Because after this incident, the Gospels fall silent again. Jesus disappears from the narrative for almost 20 years. He only reappears at 30 when he is baptized by John the Baptist and begins his public ministry. 20 years, and about those 20 years, we know nothing. Where was Jesus? What was he doing? What was his relationship with Mary during that time? Tradition says he worked as a tekton, like Joseph, that he lived in Nazareth, that he was simply known as the son of Mary, a strange designation in a patriarchal culture where people were identified by their father. Mark 6:3 records this. When Jesus returns to Nazareth as a preacher, people say, "Isn't this the carpenter, the son of Mary?" Not the son of Joseph, the son of Mary. This could mean that Joseph was already dead, or it could mean something darker, that Jesus was known by his mother's name because there were doubts about who his father was. The stigma of premarital pregnancy never completely disappeared. 30 years later, people were still whispering, and Mary heard those whispers. Every time someone called Jesus Son of Mary with that specific tone, she knew what they were insinuating, and she had to live with that, with the shame that never ended, with the judgment that never ceased. But something else was happening during those 20 silent years. Jesus was becoming radical. He was studying the scriptures. He was developing his own interpretations. He was preparing for a ministry that would challenge everything. The temple, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, even Rome. And Mary noticed this. She saw her son becoming more serious, more intense, more obsessed with issues of justice, liberation, radical transformation of society. And she was afraid, because she knew with the intuition of a mother who saw her child nearly killed by Herod, that this path would lead to destruction, that Rome did not tolerate revolutionaries, that the temple did not forgive heretics, that her son was walking directly into a confrontation he could not win, and she was right. The day Jesus left Nazareth forever was probably an ordinary day. There was no dramatic announcement. There was no theatrical farewell. He simply went. And suddenly, Mary found herself in the position of millions of mothers throughout history, watching a child leave for a journey she knew was dangerous, unable to do anything to stop him. Jesus was 30 years old. He had heard about John the Baptist, a wild prophet who was preaching in the Judean desert, announcing God's imminent judgment, baptizing people in the Jordan River in a ritual of purification. And Jesus, for some reason that the Gospels do not fully explain, felt he needed to go there. He needed to be baptized. He needed to start his own mission. Mary probably tried to dissuade him, probably argued, used all the maternal authority she had. But Jesus went anyway, and when he returned, he was no longer her son. He was the rabbi, the prophet, the man who began to gather disciples, to preach in synagogues, to confront authorities. And Mary stayed in Nazareth, waiting, listening to rumors. The news arrived in fragments. Jesus was healing the sick. Jesus was casting out demons. Jesus was saying disturbing things about the temple. Jesus was eating with tax collectors and prostitutes. Jesus was challenging the laws of the Sabbath. Jesus was causing scandal after scandal. And then came the news that made Mary move. They said Jesus was crazy, that he had lost his mind, that he was so consumed by his preaching that he didn't even stop to eat. Mark 3:21 records this with brutal honesty. His own people went to take charge of him, for they said, "He is out of his mind." His own people, his family. And who else would lead this intervention but Mary? She gathered Jesus' brothers, James, Joseph, Judas, Simon, and the sisters, whose names the Gospels don't even bother to mention, and they went after him, not to support him, to stop him, to bring him back to his senses, to save him from himself. When they arrived at the place where Jesus was preaching, the house was so full that they couldn't get in. They sent a message, "Your mother and your brothers are outside looking for you." And Jesus' response was devastating. He looked at the people sitting around him and said, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And then, pointing to his disciples, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother." He rejected his family, publicly. He established that his loyalty was no longer to blood ties, but to the community of faith he was building. And Mary, outside that house, heard this. She heard her son say that she was no longer special, that anyone who followed his message had more right to call him son than she did. Spinoza read this passage and saw in it the moment when Jesus completed his break with the traditional family structure. He was not just preaching a new theology, he was proposing a new form of social organization, one where blood relations were subordinate to ideological relations, where loyalty to the mission surpassed loyalty to family. This was radical, disturbing, and for Mary, it was a deep, personal rejection. But she did not give up. She continued to follow Jesus' movements from a distance. She kept hearing the stories. She kept hoping he would come to his senses. Or perhaps deep down, she began to accept something she did not want to accept, that her son truly believed he was the Messiah, that he was truly willing to die for his convictions, and that there was nothing she could do to save him. Because things were escalating, Jesus was not just irritating the local religious authorities, he was moving toward Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem was the temple, and in Jerusalem were the Romans, and Mary knew, with the certainty of someone who had already fled a massacre in her son's childhood, that Jerusalem would be the end. Did she plead? Did she try one last time to convince him? The Gospels do not say, but we know that when Jesus finally entered Jerusalem, riding on a donkey, acclaimed as king by the Passover pilgrims, Mary was there, somewhere in the crowd, watching, horrified, because she recognized the script. She had seen men challenge Rome before, and she knew how they all ended, crucified, by the roadside, as warnings, as pedagogical terror, as reminders that Rome did not tolerate rebellion. And now, her son was walking willingly toward that fate, and she could do nothing but witness. The arrest happened at night. Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane with some disciples when the soldiers arrived. Judas, one of the 12, had negotiated the betrayal for 30 pieces of silver. He arrived first, greeted Jesus with a kiss, and that was the signal. The soldiers moved in. Peter tried to resist, cutting off the ear of a servant of the high priest with a sword. Jesus rebuked him, healed the wounded man, and surrendered without a struggle. The disciples fled, all of them. Those men who had sworn eternal loyalty, who had promised to die for him, ran into the darkness like frightened rabbits. Peter stayed nearby, following at a distance, but when he was recognized, he denied 3 times that he knew Jesus. "I don't know this man." And then the rooster crowed, and Peter disappeared too, weeping in shame. But Mary did not flee. We do not know exactly when she learned of the arrest. Perhaps the next morning. Perhaps she was already in Jerusalem, staying with acquaintances, and the rumors came quickly. But we know that at some point between the arrest and the crucifixion, she was there, and she stayed. The trial was a farce. Jesus was taken first to the high priest Caiaphas, then to the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council. The charges were confusing: blasphemy, threatening to destroy the temple, claiming to be the Messiah. But the Sanhedrin did not have the authority to execute anyone under Roman occupation, so they brought Jesus to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, and there the charges changed, because the Romans did not care if Jesus had blasphemed against the Jewish God. Rome had thousands of gods. One more or less made no difference. What mattered to Rome was sedition, political rebellion, and that was what they accused Jesus of, proclaiming himself King of the Jews, challenging Caesar, inciting insurrection. Pilate was not convinced. He interrogated Jesus personally, and John records this dialogue with cutting irony. Pilate asks, "Are you the King of the Jews?" And Jesus responds with another question. "Is that your own idea, or did others talk to you about me?" It was a philosophical question, a question about authority, about truth, about how we know what we know. Spinoza would have loved this moment, because Jesus, even in the face of death, was doing what he always did, questioning assumptions, forcing people to think. But Pilate was not interested in philosophy. He was interested in maintaining order, and the crowd outside was becoming violent. The temple leaders had mobilized supporters. They were shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate tried to free Jesus. He offered the crowd a choice, to release Jesus or Barabbas, a real violent revolutionary. The crowd chose Barabbas. And then Pilate, that cowardly pragmatist, literally washed his hands in a basin of water before the crowd and said, "I am innocent of this man's blood. It is your responsibility." And he handed Jesus over to be crucified. The flogging came first. Roman whips with pieces of metal and bone at the end, designed to tear flesh. 39 lashes, the maximum allowed by Jewish law. But the Romans did not care about Jewish law. They whipped until they were tired, until the condemned was nearly dead, until the back was a mass of torn flesh and blood, and then they placed a crown of thorns on Jesus' head, not as a religious symbol, as torture and mockery. "Look, the King of the Jews!" And they spat on him, and struck him, and laughed. Was Mary watching this? Or did someone tell her later? The Gospels do not specify. But we know that when Jesus was forced to carry the cross through the streets of Jerusalem toward Golgotha, the place of the skull, Mary was there. John 19:25 confirms, "Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas and Mary Magdalene." She was close enough to see, to hear, to witness every second of that slow and brutal death that Rome had perfected as a method of public execution. Crucifixion was not just about killing. It was about terror, about maximum humiliation, about prolonged pain. The condemned was nailed or tied to the cross, usually naked, and left to die from gradual asphyxiation. As the body tired, the lungs could no longer expand. The person slowly suffocated. It could take hours, days sometimes, and during all that time, the condemned were exposed to the sun, to the rain, to the insults of the crowd, to the birds. Crucifixion was public theater of horror, and Mary was in the front row watching her son die. There are 3 hours that changed Mary forever. 3 hours that transformed her from mother into witness, from woman into symbol of suffering. 3 hours between noon and 3 in the afternoon, when Jesus, hanging on the cross, struggled for every breath as the sky darkened over Jerusalem. The Gospels record 7 phrases that Jesus is said to have spoken from the cross, 7 last words, and one of them was directed straight at Mary. John 19:26-27 recounts, "When Jesus saw his mother there, and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, 'Woman, here is your son,' and to the disciple, 'Here is your mother.'" Woman, not mother. He called her woman, a respectful term, yes, but distant, formal. And in the moment of death, in the last instant he could have said mother, he chose to create distance. He chose to establish that even there, even at that moment, horror, his relationship with her was not primarily filial, it was theological, it was symbolic. And then he handed her over to John. He transferred the responsibility. "Behold your mother. Take care of her. Protect her, because I can no longer." And from that moment on, John says, the disciple took her to his own home. Mary became orphaned of her son while he was still alive, and that may have been the deepest cruelty of all, because she did not just lose his life. She even lost the right to be recognized as his mother in that final moment. But she remained. When the male disciples fled, she remained. When Peter denied, when Judas betrayed, when everyone abandoned, she was there. And that was not courage in the heroic sense. It was something closer to the impossibility of doing anything else. How could she leave? How could any mother leave and let her son die alone? So she stayed and saw everything. She saw the soldiers casting lots for Jesus' garments, dividing his few possessions as if they were trophies. She saw the crowd mocking, "He saved others. He cannot save himself. If he is the Son of God, let him come down from the cross." She saw the two thieves crucified beside him, one insulting him, the other asking for mercy. She saw Jesus thirsty, asking for water, and receiving only vinegar on a sponge. And she saw the moment when he cried out. Mark and Matthew record that cry with the original words in Aramaic, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," my God, why have you forsaken me?" It was a cry of absolute despair, a cry that shatters all comfortable theology about sacrificial death and planned atonement. Because at that moment Jesus was not serenely fulfilling a divine plan. He was broken. He was alone. He was experiencing total abandonment, not just by friends, not just by family, but by God himself. And Mary heard that cry. She heard her son, the man she had believed to be the Messiah, the promised liberator, crying out that God had forsaken him. And what did she think? What went through her mind at that moment? Perhaps she thought, "I was wrong. The pregnancy was not divine. The mission was not real. My son was just a good man with radical ideas that led him to death. And I spent 33 years believing in an illusion." Or perhaps she thought, "God is cruel. God chose my son, gave him an impossible mission, and then abandoned him to die in the most brutal way possible. And I was complicit in this. I raised this child for the slaughter." Or perhaps, just perhaps, she managed to hold on to some residual faith that there was meaning in all of this, that somehow, in some way she could not comprehend, her son's death would serve some greater purpose. But if she had that faith, it was a faith on fire, a faith that was being tested beyond any human limit. Spinoza, reflecting on this moment, said something profound. Suffering has no intrinsic purpose. There is no divine plan that justifies torture and execution. But what human beings do with suffering, how they transform it, how they create meaning from pain, that can have purpose. Not because God willed it, but because people chose to find light in the darkness. And that is what Mary had to do. There at the foot of the cross, while her son was dying, she had to choose between collapsing into total despair or finding some way to go on. And she chose to go on, not because she was strong, but because there was no alternative. Luke says that the earth shook when Jesus died, that the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, that the Roman centurion, the same one who had overseen the crucifixion, looked at Jesus and said, "Truly, this was the Son of God." But these are theological embellishments. Mark, older and more honest, simply says that Jesus let out a loud cry and breathed his last. He cried out and died. No celestial fanfare, no cosmic signs, just a man dying in agony and his mother watching. The soldiers broke the legs of the two thieves to hasten their deaths, but when they came to Jesus, he was already dead. To be sure, a soldier pierced his side with a spear, and blood and water came out, a sign that the heart had stopped. And then came Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin who secretly sympathized with Jesus. He asked Pilate for permission to bury the body, Pilate, surprised that Jesus had died so quickly, crucified people usually took days, confirmed with the centurion and granted permission. Joseph, along with Nicodemus, another secret sympathizer, took the body down from the cross, and Mary was there. She held her dead son for the last time, the Pietà. That moment that Michelangelo would capture centuries later in marble, a mother holding the lifeless body of her adult son. But Michelangelo sculpted beauty. He sculpted dignity. The reality was blood, open wounds, a body disfigured by torture, and the smell of death, of urine and feces, because in death the body loses all control. This was the Jesus that Mary held, not the clean baby from the manger, not the eloquent preacher, the mutilated corpse of an executed criminal. They washed the body quickly. There was no time for a proper burial because the Sabbath was beginning at sunset. They wrapped him in linen with aromatic spices, an expensive mixture that Nicodemus had brought, and they placed him in a new tomb, hewn from rock, that Joseph had bought for himself but offered for Jesus. And then they rolled a large stone at the entrance, and Mary had to leave him there, in the dark, in the cold, alone. She returned to John's house. And that night, that impossible night after the longest day of her life, she had to sleep knowing that her son was dead, that it was all over, that all the promises, all the prophecies, all the miracles and teachings had ended in failure, torture, and death. And if she slept, she must have dreamed of the day she held a newborn baby in a stable and believed he would change the world, and woke up to the reality that he had changed the world, but only because Rome had crucified him as an example. The Sabbath was the longest day of Mary's life. She could not work. She could not return to the tomb. The law prohibited any activity, so she stayed at John's house, paralyzed by pain and the religious obligation to do nothing. 24 hours, where the only thing she could do was think, remember, and suffer. The women stayed with her: Mary Magdalene, Mary, the wife of Clopas, Salome, others whose names the Gospels did not preserve. They cried together, prayed together, and planned. Because as soon as the Sabbath ended, at the first sign of dawn on Sunday, they would return to the tomb. They would bring more spices. They would complete the proper burial that had not been possible on Friday night. But something was happening to Mary internally, something that the Gospels do not record because they did not know. Because Mary did not speak of it, she was taking stock of her entire life. She was reliving every moment, every decision, every choice. She was 13 years old when she became pregnant. She did not choose that, but she chose, against all fear, to carry the pregnancy to term. She chose to believe that there was meaning in it. She chose to trust in something greater than herself. She chose to accept Joseph when he could have abandoned her. She chose to flee to Egypt when Herod ordered the massacre. She chose to return to Nazareth and face the permanent scandal of being known as the woman who became pregnant before marriage. She chose to raise Jesus, even as he became more and more radical, more and more dangerous to himself. She chose to follow him when he left Nazareth. She chose to try to bring him back when she thought he had gone mad. And when he publicly rejected her, she chose to continue loving him from afar. She chose to go to Jerusalem when she knew what would happen. She chose to stay at the foot of the cross when all the men fled. And now, with him dead and buried, she was choosing to stay alive, to keep breathing, to keep existing in a world where her son no longer existed. These were not easy choices. They were not obvious choices. At every point she could have given up. She could have surrendered. She could have chosen bitterness, anger, hopelessness. But she did not choose. And Spinoza would see something crucial in this about human freedom. Because you see, Spinoza did not believe in free will in the traditional sense. For him, all our actions are determined by prior causes. We are part of nature, subject to its laws. But he believed in something he called freedom through understanding. When we understand the causes that move us, when we become aware of the forces acting upon us, we gain a form of freedom. Not the freedom to act outside of causality, but the freedom to act according to our deepest nature, consciously. And Mary, on that silent Saturday, was doing exactly that. She was understanding. She was accepting. She was integrating all her experience into a narrative that made sense to her. Not necessarily a narrative that would make meaning for anyone else, but it made sense to her. And when Sunday dawned, she was ready. Not ready for what was going to happen. No one was ready for that. but ready to continue doing what needed to be done. The women left before the sun had fully risen, carrying fragrant oils and spices, speaking softly about the practical problem that awaited them. The stone at the entrance of the tomb. It was too big. They wouldn't be able to move it by themselves. They would need to find men to help. But when they arrived at the tomb, the stone had already been removed. Mark describes their reaction with a powerful Greek word, ekthambeo, absolute terror. Not just fear, terror that paralyzes, because the stone was not just moved, it had been rolled away from the entrance. And the tomb was open. Mary Magdalene was the first to look inside, and the body was not there, the linen was folded, the spices scattered, but Jesus had disappeared. And then she saw someone. The Gospels disagree on who it was. Mark says it was a young man dressed in white. Matthew says it was an angel. Luke says there were two men in shining clothes. John says she didn't see anyone at first, only realized that the tomb was empty. But they all agree on the basics. The body was not there. And someone said, "He has risen." Mary Magdalene ran back. She found Peter and John. "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Peter and John ran to the tomb. They confirmed, empty, and they went back home, confused and scared. But Mary Magdalene stayed, crying outside the tomb. And John records that it was there, in that moment of total despair, that she saw Jesus. She didn't recognize him at first. She thought he was the gardener. She asked where they had taken the body. And then Jesus said one word, "Mary," and she recognized him. What happened next is one of the most debated moments in Christian history. Jesus said to her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father." And then he sent her, "Go and tell my brothers that I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene became the first witness, the first evangelist, the apostle to the apostles. And this is extraordinary because in a culture where the testimony of women was not accepted in court, where women were considered unreliable witnesses, Jesus chose to appear first to a woman and entrusted her with the most important message in Christian history. But where was Mary, the mother, during all this? The Gospels do not say. Was she with the other women? Was she at John's house? Why do the Gospels not place her as the first witness? Why, at this crucial moment, does the mother of Jesus disappear from the narrative? Perhaps because the evangelists did not know. Or perhaps because Mary did not witness the resurrection in the same way that Mary Magdalene did. Perhaps she did not go to the tomb that morning. Perhaps she stayed behind, too exhausted, too broken, to face seeing her son's body one more time. Or perhaps something deeper was happening. Perhaps Mary did not need to see the risen Jesus to believe. Perhaps after all she had been through, after all the impossibilities she had witnessed in his life, the resurrection was just one more, no less miraculous, but not unexpected. Because if you believe that your son was conceived by divine intervention, born to be the Messiah, and died fulfilling a sacred mission, then why would death be the end? Spinoza would have a different explanation, of course. For him, bodily resurrection was biologically impossible. What happened, in his view, was that the disciples, traumatized and desperate, had visionary experiences. They saw what they needed to see to carry on. They interpreted ambiguous events through the lens of messianic hope, and collectively created the narrative of the resurrection. But Mary, the real Mary, what did she think? When the other women returned saying that Jesus was alive, that they had seen the empty tomb, that they had spoken with him, what went through her mind? Relief, terror, disbelief, or a kind of calm recognition that yes, of course. Because from the very beginning nothing in this life made sense according to the normal rules. 40 days. That is the time that the Acts of the Apostles says Jesus remained with his disciples after the resurrection before ascending to heaven. 40 days of appearances, of final teachings, of preparing the disciples for what was to come next. And during those 40 days, Mary was there, not at the center of the narrative. The Gospels focus on the male disciples, on Peter being restored after his denial, on Thomas touching Jesus' wounds, on the appearances in Galilee, in Jerusalem, by the Sea of Tiberias. But Mary was there, on the periphery, watching, processing, trying to understand what had happened, because think about what it meant for her. For 3 days she believed her son was dead, not just dead, executed as a criminal, publicly humiliated. abandoned even by God, according to his own cry on the cross. All the purpose of her life, all the narrative she had built for 33 years, had collapsed into horror and failure. And then he came back, not as a ghost. The Gospels insist on this. He ate grilled fish. He let Thomas touch his wounds. He had a body, but it was different. He appeared and disappeared. He passed through closed doors. He was recognizable, but also strange, as if something fundamental had changed. Mary had a second chance, an opportunity to speak with her son after seeing him die. And the Gospels do not record a word of that encounter. None. We have no idea what Jesus said to her, what she said to him, if there was forgiveness for the rejection he had made of her at the foot of the cross, if there was explanation, if there was closure, absolute silence. And that silence tells a story of its own, because the Gospels were written by men, for communities where male testimony was valued. And Mary, at this point, was no longer necessary to the narrative. Jesus had risen, the apostles had been commissioned, the church was being born. And Mary, the woman who gave birth to the founder of this movement, gradually disappears from the pages of history. But there is one last mention, a single reference to her in the book of Acts, chapter 1, verse 14. After Jesus' ascension, the disciples return to Jerusalem and gather in an upper room. And the text says, "All these with one accord were devoting themselves to prayer together with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers." She was there, in the early community, praying with the disciples, and her other children too, James, Joseph, Judas, Simon. The same ones who tried to seize Jesus because they thought he was out of his mind were now part of the faith community. What changed? The resurrection or something more? Perhaps the death and resurrection of Jesus forced all of them, especially James, to reconsider everything. James would eventually become the leader of the church in Jerusalem. He would be known as James the Just, and he would eventually be martyred, thrown from the pinnacle of the temple and stoned to death by order of the high priest. Another son of Mary, killed for his religious convictions. But I am getting ahead of myself. At the moment recorded in Acts 1, Mary is just praying, waiting, along with about 120 disciples, men and women, all crowded into a room, waiting for what Jesus had promised, the Holy Spirit, the Comforter, the power that would enable them to continue his mission. And on the day of Pentecost, 50 days after Passover, 10 days after the Ascension, it happened. Luke describes it with dramatic imagery, a sound like a mighty rushing wind filling the house, tongues of fire resting on each person, and suddenly everyone speaking in foreign languages, languages they had never learned. Mary was there. The Spirit descended upon her too. Did she prophesy, speak in tongues? The early chapters of Acts talk a lot about Peter preaching, about the apostles performing miracles, about the community selling their possessions and sharing everything. But Mary once again disappears from the record, and she is never mentioned again. This is the last biblical glimpse of Mary, praying in a room with the disciples before Pentecost. After that, silence. The New Testament authors simply do not speak of her anymore. So what happened? How did she live her last years? When did she die? Where was she buried? The Bible says nothing. And it is here that later Christian tradition comes into play, filling the void with legends, veneration, and eventually, dogmas. The Catholic Church would develop over the centuries an elaborate Mariology. It would declare that Mary was conceived without original sin, Immaculate Conception dogma of 1854, that she remained a virgin for life even after the birth of Jesus, perpetual virginity, that she was assumed into heaven body and soul without experiencing physical corruption, Assumption dogma of 1950, that she intercedes for us before God, that she deserves hyperdulia, a level of veneration above the saints but below the worship due only to God. But all of this is later constructions, layers of theology laid upon the historical figure, and the more layers are added, the further the Maria reel. Spinoza saw all of this as a perfect example of how religious institutions distort history in favor of control, because the sanctified Mary, the impossible Mary, the perpetual Virgin Mary, serves a specific ideological purpose, to create a standard of femininity that no real woman can achieve, virginal yet a mother, submissive yet worthy, human yet perfect. And when no real woman can be like Mary, then all real women are, by definition, deficient, sinners, inferior, in need of salvation, control, guidance from the male hierarchy of the church. But the real Mary, the Mary before Dogma, she was exactly the opposite of that. She was a woman who made impossible decisions in impossible circumstances, who loved fiercely, who suffered deeply, who was rejected by her own son but did not abandon him, who saw everything she believed in destroyed and then reconstituted in ways she could never have predicted. She was not perfect. She was terrified during her teenage pregnancy. She tried to control Jesus when she thought he was going crazy. She stood outside when he refused to acknowledge her as family. She doubted. She suffered. She was profoundly, intensely human. And that is exactly what makes her extraordinary. There are two traditions about Mary's last years. One says she remained in Jerusalem, living with John, until she died there around the year 48 AD. The other says she went to Ephesus with John, fleeing the growing persecution in Jerusalem, and died there years later. There is a house in Ephesus, in the mountains above the ancient city, that tradition identifies as Mary's last home. Pilgrims have been visiting for centuries, but honestly we don't know, and perhaps it is fitting that we don't know, because Mary's life did not end with great public events or recorded miracles. It ended as most lives do, quietly in obscurity, perhaps surrounded by people who loved her but without fanfare, without record, without ceremony. But we can imagine. We can use what we know about the period, about the early Christian community, about elderly women in that context, and fill in the blanks with plausible possibilities. Mary would have become a respected figure in the community, not as a formal leader, because women were not allowed in that role, but as the mother of Jesus, the woman who had known him since birth, the one who could tell stories about his childhood that no one else knew, the one who had been there when everyone else fled. Young Christians would have come to her, asking for advice, wanting to hear about Jesus, and Mary, now in her 50s, 60s, grey-haired, tired body, would have shared memories, but probably edited, probably adjusted to serve the narrative the community was building. Because here is something crucial. Mary was not just a witness. She was also a participant in the creation of the myth. Every time she told a story about Jesus, she was shaping how he would be remembered, and it is unlikely that she was completely honest about everything. What mother is? She probably omitted her moments of doubt, her attempts to control Jesus, her frustrations when he rejected her. She probably emphasized the moments of divine confirmation, the times he demonstrated special power or wisdom. She was, consciously or not, sanctifying his memory. And that is human, perfectly human. It is not dishonesty. It is how grief works, how people process loss. They remember the best, forget or minimize the worst, create a narrative that allows them to continue living. But Mary was also aging in a community that was rapidly changing. The early church was not unified. There were enormous tensions between Jewish Christians who believed that Jesus' followers still needed to observe the Mosaic law, and Gentile Christians whom Paul was bringing into the movement without requiring circumcision or observance of the Torah. There were heated debates. The Jerusalem Council, recorded in Acts 15, was convened to resolve exactly this. James, the brother of Jesus, led the Judaizing faction. Paul led the more liberal faction. And they reached a tense compromise that temporarily satisfied both sides, but left the underlying tensions unresolved. Did Mary witness all of this? Did she participate in the debates? The texts do not say, but it is hard to imagine that she did not have an opinion. She had raised Jesus as an observant Jew. She had seen him in the temple, debating with rabbis. She knew he never intended to create a new religion. He wanted to reform Judaism, not abandon it. But now Paul was saying that the law was obsolete, that faith in Christ was enough, that Gentiles did not need to become Jews to be saved. And this must have deeply disturbed Mary, because it meant that the movement was drifting away from the Jewish roots that Jesus never abandoned. But she was a woman, and women had no voice in these debates. So if she disagreed, if she tried to influence, it was not recorded. What remained was her silence in the texts. And then came the persecution. Not immediately. In the early years, Christians were seen as just another Jewish sect. Annoying perhaps, but not threatening. But as they grew, as they became more visible, more vocal, the empire began to take notice. and Jerusalem became dangerous. James, the brother of Jesus, was martyred in 62 AD, thrown from the pinnacle of the temple and then stoned. Peter was likely executed in Rome during Nero's persecution in 64 AD. Paul also died during this period, beheaded as a Roman citizen. If Mary was still alive, she saw her children, her friends, all being killed one by one, and if she was not, she died before seeing the worst, before seeing Jerusalem destroyed in 70 AD, before seeing the temple burned, before seeing Judaism and Christianity definitively separate into hostile movements against each other. Either option is tragic, dying too soon to see the conclusion of the story you started, or living too long and seeing everything you loved destroyed. But at some point, probably between 50 and 70 AD, Mary died. There is no record of how. Natural old age, illness, violence? We do not know. She was buried. Where? We do not know. Was there a funeral? Who attended? We do not know. The Catholic Church would later invent the assumption, the idea that Mary was taken up to heaven, body and soul, without experiencing death or decay. But this is obviously later theology. The real Mary died, like everyone dies, and her body decomposed, like everyone decomposes. And perhaps that is precisely what makes her so important, not because she transcended humanity, but because she embraced it completely. She lived, suffered, loved, lost, and died, and yet somehow her life had meaning, not because it was supernatural, but because it was authentically human. So how do we evaluate Mary's life? How do we summarize an existence that began in a scandal of teenage pregnancy and ended in the anonymity of an unrecorded death? How do we understand a woman who was transformed into a symbol, but who was, above all, a person? Spinoza gives us tools for this. He would say, forget the miracles, forget the perpetual virginity, forget the bodily assumption into heaven, forget all the dogmas that have been piled onto this woman like layers of makeup hiding a real face, and look at what remains. What remains is a young woman who became pregnant under circumstances that should have killed her, but did not, who had a child in extreme poverty and risk, who fled as a refugee to protect him, who raised him in an insignificant village where everyone judged her, who saw him become a religious revolutionary, who tried to protect him from himself and failed, who was publicly rejected by him, who stood by him when he was executed, and who then somehow found the strength to carry on, to join the community of his followers, to live a few more years carrying all that weight of memory, trauma, and perhaps also some strange form of peace. This is an extraordinary life, not because it was supernatural, but because it demonstrates resilience, courage, and the ability to endure the unbearable. And here is where Spinoza's philosophy becomes profoundly relevant. For Spinoza, freedom is not the ability to choose outside of all causal determination. That is impossible. Freedom is understanding. It is knowing the forces that act upon you. It is accepting the necessity of things, and it is acting according to your deepest nature in harmony with that necessity. Mary did that. She did not choose to become pregnant. That was determined by causes she could not control. But she chose, within the narrow limits of what was possible, how to respond. She chose not the clandestine abortion that could have killed her. She chose not the suicide that would have freed her from shame. She chose to carry the pregnancy, to accept Joseph, to raise the child. At every point of crisis, at every impossible moment, she made choices, limited choices, choices within a brutal system of patriarchal, imperial, religious oppression, but real choices nonetheless. And cumulatively, those choices defined her life. Spinoza also teaches us about joy and sadness. For him, joy is what we feel when our power to act increases, when we become more capable, more free, more complete. And sadness, it is the opposite. It is a diminishment of power. It is feeling less capable, less free. Maria's life was filled with sadness in this sense. She was constantly limited. As a woman, as a poor person, as a mother of a child she could not control. Each rejection from Jesus, each moment of danger, each social restriction diminished her power. But there were also moments of joy. When she held her baby for the first time despite all the horror of childbirth, when Joseph chose to stay with her, when Jesus, still a child, did something that filled her with maternal pride, when she heard that he was healing people, changing lives. These moments increased her power, made her feel that her life had value. And perhaps in the end, The balance is not as important as the fact that she continued, that she never gave up, that until the last day she remained in the struggle, in life, in the constant attempt to find meaning amidst the chaos. This, for Spinoza, is virtue, not abstract moral perfection, but perseverance, conatus, the effort of each thing to persist in its being. Maria had conatus in abundance. And what did the Church do with her? Transformed her into something she was never, an impossible perpetual virgin, a figure of supernatural purity, an icon so distant from common human experience that no real woman can truly relate to her. This is not homage, it is theft. It is taking an extraordinary human life and draining all humanity from it. It is turning a woman into propaganda for the control of other women. Because see what happens when you put Maria on an impossible pedestal. You create a standard that no real woman can reach. You say, Maria was a virgin and a mother. Why can't you be? Maria was submissive and obedient. Why can't you be? Maria endured everything without complaint. Why can't you be? And when real women inevitably fail to reach this impossible standard, the Church has a ready answer. You need our guidance, our authority, our mediation between you and God, because you are not Maria. You are just an ordinary sinner. But here is the truth. Maria was also just an ordinary woman. She was not especially pure. She had a premature pregnancy. She aged. She had other children after Jesus. She doubted. She made mistakes. She was human. And it is precisely because she was human that her story matters, because it means that anyone, in any circumstance, can demonstrate the same kind of courage, resilience, and fierce love that she demonstrated. You don't need to be a virgin. You don't need to have a miraculous conception. You don't need to be chosen by angels. You just need to be human. And choose every day within the limits of what is possible to act with integrity, compassion, and courage. That is the real lesson of Maria. Not the Maria of dogmas, but the Maria before dogma, the real woman who lived, suffered, loved, and died, and who by doing so demonstrated something profound about what it means to be human in a world that constantly tries to dehumanize us. So we come to the end, to the conclusion of this journey through the life of a woman the world knows but never really knew. Maria, Miriam, mother, widow, witness, survivor. And the question that remains is, what do we do with this story? How do we live after seeing through the veils of dogma and finding a real person on the other side? For some, this will be disturbing, because it is comforting to have certainties. It is comforting to have an impossible, perfect Maria who intercedes for us from above, who understands but does not judge, who is a universal mother but never real enough to be complicated. But Spinoza taught us that comfort is not the same as truth, and that seeking truth is always worthwhile, even when it is uncomfortable. Especially when it is uncomfortable. Because when you see Maria as she really was, something extraordinary happens. You realize that holiness is not distance from humanity. It is deep commitment to it. That the divine, if it exists, is not in denying our nature but in fully realizing it, in being so completely human that we transcend the limitations of selfishness, fear, and pettiness. Maria did that, not because she was supernatural, but because in every moment of terror she chose love. In every moment of rejection she chose to persist. In every moment when she could have surrendered to hatred, bitterness, despair, she chose to continue. And this is not just her story. It is the story of millions of women throughout history, women whose names were never recorded, who raised children in poverty, who survived violence, who were judged by brutal societies, who loved fiercely despite everything, and who, dying in obscurity, left the world slightly better for having been in it. Maria is not unique. She is archetypal. She represents something universal in the human experience, the capacity to endure the unbearable. And this is not a miracle in the supernatural sense, but it is a miracle in the deepest sense. It is what makes human life possible in a world that constantly tries to destroy it. The Church stole this from us when it turned Maria into an icon, because icons are unattainable. But real women, women like the historical Maria, are accessible inspiration. They say, you can too. You too, in your impossible circumstances, can find strength, can make choices that matter, can create meaning where there seems to be none. And perhaps in the end, that is what Maria teaches us. Not doctrine, not dogma, but something more fundamental, that being human is enough, that our lives, so brief and fragile, so full of pain and confusion, still have value, that love, even when rejected, is not wasted, that suffering, when faced with courage, can be transformed into wisdom. These are not religious truths. They are human truths, and they do not belong to any church, to any dogma, to any theological system. They belong to all of us, because all of us at some point are Maria. We are the scared person making an impossible decision. We are the mother watching a child take a dangerous path. We are the witness to horror who needs to find a reason to keep living. And when we are in those moments, we do not need perpetual virginity. We do not need bodily assumption into the heavens. We need the example of a woman who was there before us, who felt the same terror, who made choices with the same trembling hands, and who, somehow, survived, not unscathed, but survived. This is the Maria that matters, the Maria before dogma, the Maria of history, the human Maria. And she is, precisely because she is human, infinitely more inspiring than any marble statue could be. So when you look at an image of Maria again, in a church, in a book, anywhere, try to see through the icon. Try to imagine the 13-year-old girl in Nazareth. Try to feel the weight of the impossible choice. Try to understand the courage that was needed, and recognize in her not a distant divinity, but a sister in humanity. Because this is the true revolution. Not turning humans into gods, but recognizing the divine in the human, seeing that the sacred is not above us, unattainable, judging from afar. It is here, in every act of courage, in every choice of love. In every moment we choose to continue despite everything. Maria lived this. Not perfectly, not without fear, not without doubt, but she lived. And that, in the end, is all any of us can do. Live, completely, courageously, humanly, and perhaps, just perhaps, that is miracle enough.